on the other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
Ever since War for Cybertron, Hasbro has been hellbent on redoing the 84 to 86 cast, much to the dismay of many of us. In most instances, these updates at least justify themselves as their own unique experiences, even if they don't necessarily need to be replacements in your collection. Sometimes things don't work out as well as the designers would have hoped though. Sometimes Hasbro and Takara up. Last year, to celebrate the release of War for Cybertron on Netflix, geez, that was a regrettable decision, I took a look at the Decepticon version from the Netflix line, a deeply disappointing purchase and a deeply disappointing update of the old Liger fellow. It was at least an ambitious attempt that attempted to do some really interesting things, but it face-planted hard due to massive kibble issues in both modes. How the f do you even do that? And the original version, which thankfully I skipped, was even worse. It was incredibly disappointing for those who voted for him in the fan poll, and for me it was kind of funny that the ones who lost ended up getting the better end of the stick. Maybe they miscalculated the votes and maybe they ended up jumping the gun, but whatever the case, it was a deeply disappointing figure. But that doesn't change the fact that since Generations has begun, we haven't received a Mirage that really hits the spot. Or have we? Greetings Cybertronians, I'm Dr. Lockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to Classics Deluxe Class Mirage. To some extent, all vehicle modes in Generations have to be modernized. Whether it's due to licensing issues or just a bit of clunkiness with the original, things often need to be changed. And more often than not, I think the fandom can agree it's for the better. Hey, I said more often than not. Thing is, modernization ideologies have changed over the years. It's been a slow process, but they definitely pushed stylization to its limits at the start, whereas things are much more reserved now. As such, Mirage turns into a much more angular Formula 1 car than the G1 original, and f***ing Christ, this has to be one of the most gorgeous Classics alternate modes I've ever seen. I'm not exaggerating, this car is exceptionally clean, incredibly cohesive, wonderfully sculpted, beautifully painted. It's honestly the works here. Given the period this came out in, this is especially commendable. The Classics lineup was pretty hit or miss with their alternate modes, so to see something that's not just this well done, but also this timeless is really giving me good vibes. It's easily the most aerodynamic Mirage I've come across. Granted, I've never handled the G1 version, but out of the two, now 3 that I do own, he instantly demolishes the competition. Every single part, from the bumper to the spoiler to even the cockpit, angles upwards to slice through reality itself like a subtle knife. Speaking of the cockpit, it's quite hilarious that they've got the head peeking out there. Don't know why, but I really like this addition. Of course, being a Classics figure, this thing is covered head to toe with fantastic mechanical detail. Given that the line was kind of all over the place with how each figure was represented, this style fits sort of in line with what you might see in Gundam 00, if that makes any sense. Probably doesn't, but that's the vibe I'm getting. Fortunately, you need no such point of reference to enjoy this design. It's got so much to love. Even the spoiler has Greebling on it. Mate, that's insane. Thankfully, none of it ends up being overbearing. It ends up being incredibly mature and perfectly complements the deco. See, I say deco and not specifically paintwork because the paint itself is only really serviceable. You get some wonderful color correction around the place. And I'm really happy they painted the hubcaps, which go hand in hand with the pinned wheels by the way. But the deco doesn't really draw any attention to the paint itself. No, the main attraction, deco-wise, is the Tampograph show. This is something I really appreciated from the Aaron Archer era, and I'm pretty sad it hasn't made a comeback outside of a few MMC releases and one Earthrise mold. You get a shit ton of references to the G1 cartoon, some of which are obvious, whilst others not so. I also really love how the text calls back to the G1 toy, as opposed to just slapping some random font on the side, as we've seen them do when copyright tensions rise. As is often the case, it's not good because it's G1, it's good because the G1 stylings were as good as they were. Beyond that, there are just so many things to gush about with this vehicle. The transparent aqua pops way more than any other example I've seen. The underside somehow ends up clean as a whistle, despite the complicated transformation. The back section, although a smidge gappy, molds in exhaust pipes because f*** you, why not just... I just love this vehicle mode so much. Now, to a lot of people, this vehicle mode will be unacceptable because it's not the wide, flat design they're used to from the toy or the cartoon. That's not typically how I judge designs, though. For me, it's more of a question of whether it stands on its own or not. This is easily a design that stands on its own, and there's so little I can find fault with. The only thing I genuinely think could have been improved is the fact that the spoiler doesn't tab in. It just sort of sits there and relies on the friction of the ball joint, which, as many of you are aware, may break down over time. It's just a thing friction joints do in general. Still, it seems to be holding up after 10 years, probably because it doesn't have any weight on it. So even if I would have preferred a locking mechanism, it still works well enough. That said, there is one other quote-unquote flaw that may drive people off. I don't consider it a flaw per se, but it may piss off a certain crowd of people. The front, unfortunately, is a parts-forming gun. To some, that may be a deal-breaker. However, for a few reasons, it doesn't quite register as such to me. Firstly, removing it doesn't necessarily ruin the alt mode, so even if you lose it, the whole package still looks like a reasonably functioning futuristic Formula 1 car. Not a perfect one, but still an alright one. Secondly, I always give a pass to weapon parts forming. If something turns into a gun like this, I'm perfectly okay with it. It isn't just turning into a backpack that could have been easily incorporated into the transformation, provided they went back to the drawing board and started from
Krebs, can you stop it with the cliff jumper It's getting
If comparisons
ridiculous!
keep coming out, what am I supposed to do? Deny people the information?
If I
required?
catch you being that critical again, I'm gonna punish you with magic!
I'm a YouTuber. It's my job to be critical. Point is, I think it's fine, as it doesn't seem like your traditional parts forming cop-out to me, and even if you don't, I believe it can be looked past, unlike certain other examples. In case it isn't obvious, I absolutely adore this alternate mode. This is exactly what I wanted from both the Siege and Iron Factory versions, but both of those just ended up being clunky in their execution. It's kind of funny how the oldest version of the three still remains the best attempt. As for fitting in with Modern Warfare Cybertron figures, I reckon he works well enough. There are some figures that flat out do not work in today's context, but I believe this one isn't too far off from the trilogy's aesthetic. You can't even make the argument that it's the wrong size, because honestly, given how close he is to the dimensions of the Siege toy, scale nutters will probably not take issue either. So yes, as far as the vehicle mode is concerned, he knocks it out of the park and still works perfectly alongside modern offerings. Of course, his transformation is a little different engineering-wise, but that doesn't mean it's bad in any way. To show such, let's speed right into it. What you'll find with many modern generations Transformers is they copy the original G1 transformation in some sense. With classics though, that just wasn't the case. Everything was brand new and a fresh, interesting take on the character, transformation included. And that's one of the reasons I love it so much. You never know what you're gonna get with the transformation, because everything is vastly different. Of course, the first thing you want to do is remove this gun here. Oh no, parts forming that I've already gone over. Bring up this section here, and that'll make things easier later on. Come to the bottom and unhook these two tabs here. That'll give the legs enough clearance to fold out on the double hinges. Fold the feet into place out of the spoiler. You've got the arms back here, and they rotate out, and they've got the double hinges that also rotate out. Bada bing, bada boom, there we go. And be careful not to pop off the waist. It is a little bit loose. Not tolerance-wise, it's nice and tight that way, but it does tend to fall off. Anyway, rotate it around 180 degrees, and then the chest is genius. You want to push it back just a little bit, and then rotate this vent section all the way around 180 degrees, and at that point you can kind of just push that in, just leave that sitting against there. And then this is super cool. You push this chest section out of there, and all the way around and into there. It doesn't clip into place, it just sits there, which is a bit annoying, but my word, what a brilliant way to transform the chest. It utilizes both faux and real parts, and that is incredibly cool. Might eventually go back and paint that a bit of a darker blue though, but that's just my own personal preference. It looks fine the way it is. Anyway, rotate the arms around into place, rotate the arms around and bring out the fists, same on the other side, and that's it. Nice and simple, but oh so effective. Like, Jesus, I wish more transformations would do this. I wish more transformations would throw out the original ideas and just create something new and innovative. Don't get me wrong, a lot of Studio Series figures do that, but they're basing things off the CGI model. This is designed to be a toy first and foremost, and it really works well. Yes, occasionally we do get cases like this where they deviate from the original quite heavily. In fact, Beast Wars Megatron comes to mind, but not to this level. I really want to see them do this again, because this is awesome. Pre-Prime Wars trilogy designs were somewhat inconsistent with their stylings. That was part of the charm of the era though, as much like a Forrest Gump box of chocolates, you never knew what you were going to get. The flavor of this week is decidedly IDW, although the precise stylings he embodies wouldn't be seen for at least a couple years. Point is though, this design is dynamic as and I feel that allows him to embody his slick character traits perfectly. Mirage is a narcissistic f***wit, not to the same level as Skylinks, but still quite a bit. As such, an old chunkster doesn't seem to make much sense, which is ironically what the G1 toy was like, the Siege toy too, to a certain extent. Granted, this is pushing a lot of those ideas to the extreme, and it will turn off quite a few purist fans. For everyone left though, again, it's a fantastic design. Every angle draws your attention downwards, enforcing the speedy idea, where all power is pushed into the feet. He's a race car, so in all honesty, it makes sense. And my word, the legs are brilliantly designed. Well, mostly anyway, but we'll get to that. The back of the car forms wonderful knee detail, and the spoiler feet work pretty well in extending the articulation beyond its limits. Sure, it's no substitute for your good old-fashioned ankle tilt, but most poses will still work well enough. I also love how the quadruple exhaust pipes fold out of the knees as you bend them. And look at this, functioning hip skirts. Sure, a more modern and far more efficient design would go for enclosed hips, but this is a hella fun feature nonetheless. That's actually something quite common with this figure. It's got a few dated aspects here and there, but it pushes what it can do to the limits, and as such it's aged like fine wine. Take the waist for example. Hello, nice and expressive swivel. You can tell the designer wanted to make sure it was incorporated into the design at all costs, so they engineered it into the transformation, thereby making it impossible to remove. It's actually a similar philosophy to Classics Prime and Generations Dark Mounts. Yes, those aren't the only two examples, but they're the only two I can think of at the moment. Also, while doing some research, apparently Classics Prime was supposed to be a deluxe at some point with a trailer. Kind of fun finding out random shit like this on TF Wiki. Also kind of funny that KO companies always go in the opposite direction of scaling. But yes, back to the waist swivel. Be warned, it does have a tendency to pop off, and no, it's not a de facto throwback to the brittle nature of the Generation 1 toy. This is a f*** up, nothing more. Even then though, it's hardly something worth getting angry over, especially with a truly divine chest design. I love how these vents just pop out and become a feature, and the half faux, half real chest flip over mechanism is really clever. Also, once again, Thank you for choosing the original font. I'm so glad we didn't have to deal with the basic shit on the front of the chest. Now, some people have complained that the head is far too small, but honestly, I think it's perfectly sized for this slender fellow. Sure, if he had a bit more heft to him, it might have seemed a bit out of place. However, on a design this slim, it works perfectly. It's also painted to the absolute shit, and like many toys from the period, goes nuts on the light piping. Then you combine it with these super expressive arms, and the whole design emanates personality. Even the hands are pretty satisfactory. Now, that in itself isn't anything to gawk at, but in the context of the classics period, right off the tail end of the Unicron trilogy, many designs just added in a default cube, extruded a few angles, and hey presto, done deal. See, things like this push the figure into modernity. Small touches such as these allow him to share shelf space with even War for Cybertron and Prime Wars figures without even batting an eye. There's so little wrong with this figure. All I can really think of is that pesky waist, which I've already discussed. And, well, actually, on second thought, yeah, that's a bit of a problem. Now, normally, I don't mind hollowness. Budgets are thin, and even something as simple as adding a flap can have ripple effects, such as neutering the articulation, killing the paint job, and sometimes even making the toy unsellable in Western markets. However, two things. Firstly, as I've said many times, my hollowness tolerance has a limit. If it's visible from the front, that's a no-go. Fortunately, that's not an issue here. On the limbs is fine, but the torso should be 100% perfect. Again, not an issue here. Unfortunately, I only typically give leeway to one side of hollowness, and sadly, this figure goes over the line with two. Not only is the back hollow, but so is the knee cavity on the side. I get why it's like this due to the transformation, and with those huge knee pistons, it's easily ignored. But for me, I think it's just a smidge over the limit, so I have to call foul on this one. Secondly, this isn't 2016, it's only 2006. Budgets were far more, stretchy in this time period. The oil price hike hadn't quite kicked in, and Walmart wasn't breathing down Hasbro's neck to cut costs, allegedly. Those things are only rumors I've heard across the fandom. Someone should really do some research and find out the definitive answer. Too bad I'm too lazy to do that. With the extended budget, maybe they could have taken a page out of Iron Factory's book and had the wheels fold into the back. Although to be fair, one, that company wouldn't exist for half a decade, and two, that toy's implementation was kinda shit. Although that's thanks to the god-awful decision to make the wheels heel spurs. Classics Mirage has nice clunky supports, so that wouldn't have been an issue. Still, it's very difficult to notice these hollow sections anyway, and that's due to the final issue. No thigh swivels. Come the f*** on, man. This thing is articulated to hell and back. Waist swivels, double jointed elbows, hip skirts, head tilts, feet that can be cheated into an ankle tilt. There's almost every thing here. We were on the verge of greatness. We were this close, but then for some reason, boom, no thigh swivels. And sure, this is 2006. This standard of articulation hadn't quite been implemented yet. We'd just gotten out of the Unicron trilogy for Pete's sake. But still, in almost every other category, this figure is near perfect. Well, aside from the gun, that's a bit But that aside, it's so close to being a fully modern release, and it just falls short of the finishing line. The reason I feel so frustrated by these issues is it strives so hard to be the absolute perfect Mirage. And with a few modifications, it could have basically secured its place as such not just for the years since its release, but potentially for the next decade from now. This thing is mere millimeters from perfection, but a few key moments just hold it back. But you know what? And even with these issues, there's just so much to love here that I couldn't possibly not recommend it to all of you. The articulation that is here is stellar, the paintwork is phenomenal, the detail is, well, you can already see how good it is. He even scales well with modern toys. Probably. What, you think I'm gonna check the Sunbow chart? That thing barely even scales with itself. This review isn't one I wrote out of nostalgia. I started collecting in late 2007 and never got exposed to classics as a kid. In fact, I only bought this figure a couple of months ago off a mate. Every praise I give this figure is purely on its own merits. Keep in mind, this is a really good year for Transformers. We've had so many amazing figures to grab on the shelves already. So when I say this is one of the best figures I've gotten all year, well, you know I say that without a shred of hyperbole. This figure isn't just the definitive Mirage because the other examples have failed spectacularly. He is so because he is a fantastic figure in all aspects. Does he have issues? Yes. Is he dated in a few areas? Absolutely. But is he also exceedingly modern in plenty of others? Hell the yes. And sure, leaks have stated that there is an Earth mode of this fella coming, potentially as an Amazon exclusive. Yeah, Earth modes of previously released characters as Amazon exclusives. Big surprise. But considering the issues with the base mold, I'm not so certain that's a good one to bet on. So, ultimately, while I don't usually consider figures to be the definitive version, and I'm happy to collect multiple versions of any given character, this Mirage is my definitive Mirage, and I think it's a safe bet to keep him as such for the future. And who knows, maybe people who didn't swap the first time round will be selling this on the aftermarket. And you know what that means? Cheap pickups. So much like many cases that I've reviewed before, there will probably be a chance in the future for you to pick this up. But whatever happens, I'm really glad to have this right now. He was an unexpected purchase, an impulse buy, but my word, I am satisfied in almost every single way.